this is part 3 of the talk on From Opium to Opioids. In part 1, we talked about the history of opium. In part 2, we mostly talked about the politics of opium trade from East India Company to China and the wars that took place and the big role of the two enterprising Jewish entrepreneurs or opium traders who went on and became enormously rich. They're named Sassoon and Kaduris. In part 3, we talked about the chemistry of morphine and the varieties of action and some of the neuroscience behind it. And today, finally, we'll get down to the big problem that we've encountered and is still going on in different forms from opioid crisis. So let's get started. Okay, and these are the opium derivatives can become in varieties of forms. First was the natural forms, which has been around for thousands of years. Second was the morphine that was synthesized in the 19th century and became the mainstay of a physician's drug bag. And later on, with the rise of chemistry, the molecules have been modified in varieties of ways, which includes non-synthetic and synthetic to change the efficacy and potency of the drug, including codeine, which was relatively milder and was primarily marketed for anti-tussive or coughing effect, and hydrocodone, which is a stronger pain relief. And then later on, the real true synthetic opium derivatives or morphine derivatives came into existence. Methadone, which became the big stay in withdrawal or from addiction on a controlled substance. And last but not the least, a totally synthetic but extremely powerful agent called fentanyl, which was primarily marketed for anesthesia. And now you can see that the FDA, in their infinite wisdom, has been trying to regulate this. And there are various schedules that physicians have to abide by. Obviously, there are no prescription need for heroin and LSD, so these are Schedule 1 drugs, so they could be used for research, but there is no clinical use for it. And the Schedule 2 are your cough pain medications, OxyContin and Adderall, which is used for ADHD. And the one which a lot of physicians used during their training, Tylenol with codeine, without really emphasis on how much addictive potential it had. And the other drugs, such as ketamine, which was used for short intravenous anesthesia and is primarily used in animal products. And the others have Schedule 4, which are your tranquilizers, such as Xanax and Valium, which became popular in the 60s and earlier one, and which is where the big culprits of the opioid crisis, Sacklers, came into big foray in terms of how they use their marketing savvy to promote tranquilizers such as Librium and Valium to physicians. And the age of anxiety took over, and the last are Schedule 5, which are just a simple Robitussin cough mixture, which can even be used in small doses for children. So that just gives you the basic classification that is there. Now, moving on to the big news item, which is fentanyl. This was synthesized by a Belgian pharmacist named Janssen, and that he went on to find the big Janssen Pharmaceutical, which is a multinational corporation. And he was a giant in his own right, and not only synthesized fentanyl, but went on to synthesize many more drugs. And he was a chemist of genius par excellence. And as I mentioned a little while ago, this was a choice of anesthesia and was used in a very controlled environment in the beginning. And then later on, varieties of modes of administration were developed, including a patch which was called Duragesic for severe pain, such as fracture or post-operative pain. And there is also now a lozenge, active lozenge that is marketed, and then obviously the drug culture discovered, you know, the high that they could get from it. And when heroin supply became restricted, this almost took place of it. And these two little bottles can show us to how much heroin can be fatal. On the other hand, the amount of fentanyl, which you can see there are a few crystals at the bottom of this small tube that you can see that can be fatal. So it's extremely lethal and potent. And this was the Janssen went on to become a pharmaceutical company, which is now subsidiary of the big American multinational Johnson and Johnson. And now, obviously, there is so much potential for street use and money that is involved that it is mixed with varieties of other drugs to increase the profits. And then later on, now there is an epidemic of all so-called designer drugs with slight modification of the chemical formula, and it is it is marketed as a better and improved version of street drug, and some of the ones that are marketed have some horrendous side effects that it can cause, almost like a Parkinson-like rigidity and serious neurological side effects. But so that these drugs are absolutely lethal and has some really horrendous side effects. And just as a okay, and there are some other ones which are actually used for animal sedation, and it's called carfentanil. That's even much more potent than fentanyl, if you can believe that. And the amount of profits that the drug dealers make from that is just mind-boggling. A $3 product which can be imported and very easily from China or Mexico, for that matter, can have a street value of $800 in U.S. street market. So you can just see that that's a huge profit greed that involves thousands of illegal trade that has risen to meet the demand of the drug culture. And again, this just again shows in a larger dose as the lethal dose of fentanyl and heroin. You can see how carfentanil is 50 times more potent than heroin and 100 times the carfentanil that we talked about, which is used for elephants. So you can see how that can be fatal for average 170-pound man. Okay, and hopefully this was, and the initial drug that was marketed by a small pharmaceutical firm called Insys, and they marketed under a product name called Subsys. Okay, and that was kind of a play on the brand name for the drug, which was used for sublimits for anesthesia. And the two chemists or pharmacy PhDs, one was an Asian Indian named John Kapoor and his associate. They marketed this, really heavily, and actually paying off several physicians who were involved and accepted illegal payments. And so this was a really specialist pharmacy, but that had a very corrupt marketing practices. And eventually they were caught, and I think Kapoor and the other doctors who were involved are now serving prison sentence. And they had recruited almost totally unexperienced salespeople, and they wined and dined and bribed physicians. And this was frontline is a well-known television program on the public television channel in the United States. And they had this was one of their documentaries called Pain Hustlers, that he was somebody that was, and people were marketed for severe pain, and a little realizing that it had a very lethal potential. And due to copyright laws, I'm not going to be able to show this, but there's a link for those who are interested in this on the slide, so that should be clickable. So it was really a dark chapter in the medical industrial complex of United States. And you can just see how much payments that were given. This was in the 80s, so you can just see that the payments were substantial. That was a revenue that they generated from marketing these drugs. Okay, and a lot of times, there were warnings for these drugs. That some of the academic pharmacologists, one that needs to be mentioned, from UC Davis, pharmacology professor, suggested that there is a serious potential for abuse, but his warnings were ignored, and death can be so quick that people who are abusing this can die with the needle still in their arms. And the epidemic was so intense that some of the corners of the major cities both on the East Coast and West Coast were overwhelmed with this. And so this was started back in 88, and it is likely that efforts to restrict importation of natural products and prevent diversion became more effective, and they'll become increasingly more important in drugs of abuse. So there was a warning that was issued, but the authorities in various stages did not heed the attention. And so this was the pharmacological name, as we talked about earlier. Okay, I'm just summarizing this. It's for anesthesia. This is a dramatic belief that it's a quick induction drug, and because during anesthesia the induction is a very critical phase, and patient should be put to sleep so that the anesthesiologist can intubate the patient very quickly and take over the breathing during surgery. So it has a dramatically altered, and this was, again, we already talked about, and along with that, this is relatively easy to synthesize, and just with a few chemicals, somebody can turn into a raw material into street value drugs. This is similar to methamphetamine labs, but those were risky. But fentanyl does not explode, But so this is, again, and this anybody with high school chemistry can market this in about learn the technology in about a week, So these are all. This is now a Schedule 1 drug, but that doesn't stop people from abusing it. Okay, and there are also, and this is an example as to how people can use it. This is a high school graduate who was marketed as evil genius, and at age of 15 he started manufacturing and flooding the East Coast market in the 80s, and there are varieties of private labs, and he became obviously immensely rich. And this was eventually he was caught, and he died in prison in Oklahoma in 2017. And just within 1 year, between 2013 and 14, there was a 400% rise. And that initial drugs were not illegal until a country criminalizes them. So the FDA and the Drug Administration are always catching behind. The drugs appear on the street, and so by the time the regulators get around, the enterprising bad characters have moved on to another chemical, and they have to start the procedure all over again. And there were, this became a various statewide problems. Laboratory was started by George Marquardt in Kansas City, and that was linked directly to a huge number of deaths on the East Coast of the United States. And so this is has been a problem not just in the United States, but also in Europe. The Russians used varieties of fentanyl derivatives during the hostage crisis. So it is used by state agents as a chemical agent for killing people. At the same time, the street volume is dramatic. At the same time, this is, you may have heard about this. He was the kingpin of heroin drug and was immensely rich. And in spite of being the United States being aware, they had tremendous difficulty in getting him extradited because he almost controlled the Mexican empire, and a lot of the legal authorities were in his pay. And so even though he was, and he obviously was spreading his wealth, so the locals were protecting him. And he was, even though he was arrested, but he was savvy enough and he was able to bribe the system in Mexico that he was able to escape twice through tunnels. And so and at the same time, he was almost like a semi Robin Hood type of agent. So the locals in his states protected him. And eventually, he was arrested and finally was extradited in 2016, and he's currently serving prison in somewhere in the United States. But even though just because he disappeared doesn't mean that the drug trade has collapsed. There are others who have taken his place, and this is now China is the big actor. The varieties of small Chinese chemical industries are selling precursors and exporting them to Mexico, and where small laboratories are synthesizing them to fentanyl and a variety of derivatives. And the Chinese laws are different, and they don't have a whole lot of incentive. Whenever the pressure is put on China, they will ban one chemical, but the savvy chemists have moved on to another chemical, which is not illegal. So, and there's a well-known book by a very investigative journalist, Mr. O'Keefe, who had written a book called Empire of Pain in 2022. He went to China and interviewed a lot of the small companies owners, and and their cause was, we're not doing anything illegal against Chinese laws, and we don't know what happens to our products. So he was able to actually place the order. So it's a very eye-opening book called Empire of Pain for those who want to know more about it. Okay. All right. And again, one can say this is an older slide, but still gets the point across. Even as early as that time, there were, number of deaths have been 500,000. So it just probably exceeds the deaths from COVID, and which, obviously not to downplay COVID, but again, this is a crisis that is ongoing, and we haven't found a good solution for it. It's a multi-layer problem that started from prescription drug, which we'll get to when we talk about Sacklers and the role of Purdue Pharma. And then later on, people moved on to, when that was regulated and curbed, people moved on to heroin. And when the supply was tightened up by reducing the trade, people moved on to synthetic overdoses, which were harder to pin down and were equally lucrative for the drug industry. Okay, let's see. I think hopefully we can play this without encountering problems. I think that may be a problem because it's a 60-minute clip and they do not like to share this with you. So it was an interview with El Chapa, I think so, but I don't think I'm going to be able to share it with you due to the fact that YouTube does not like infringing on 60-minute overtime things. So sorry about that. Okay, and these are the Chinese companies that are in various areas, so they've been tied to more than thousands of deaths. There are varieties of companies, which are taxed, and they just managed to skirt about the Chinese laws. And again, unfortunately, there is no extradition treaty with China, so that again, limits the hands of the DEA. Okay, and you can just see from this graph as to the market that's come from China. It goes to both borders of United States and Canada, and there are varieties of ways the market is precursor sent back from one way or the other, and the traffic continues from both sides of United States. And there are varieties of analogs, as we mentioned earlier, and some of these are so lethal that even when there is a drug bust, the chemical can be airborne, and even the agents or the police or the uh, paramedics who are at the scene, they could get exposed and die. So they need to handle this with gloves and like as if it's a potential deadly virus. So it's not a easy one to handle or crack down, unlike heroin or other things. At the same time, the internet has been boon and a curse, that there is a whole subculture of dark web, and one of the characters was a guy named Ross Ulbricht, who was right under the nose of FDA in San Francisco, and he created a whole network called Silk Road and used varieties of dark web browsers supplied by Bitcoin and cryptocurrency, and was responsible for $1 billion trade in varieties of drugs. And it took a long time for FDA to crack his Silk Road establishment. And one of the computer magazine called Wired has done a big expose story on it. And there is finally they were able to catch, and put him in jail after a long hard investigative journalism. Okay, and this is at the same time there was and he was another Canadian named Alexander Cassis. Okay, he was a Canadian who established a similar trade in from Thailand and took over where Ross Ulbricht had left, called AlphaWeb. And these people were into making billions of dollars, and it took various international agencies to capture him with a sting operation involving multiple nations in United States, Eastern Europe, and Southeast Asia. Okay, and at the same time, the physician community, knowingly or unknowingly, played a role in creating at least the prescription drug crisis, because with the continued or increasing survival of cancer patients who lived but they were in severe pain, and therefore with well-intentioned articles were placed that the pain relief, we were undertreating the pain, and pain became almost the fifth sign. Okay, and at the same time, some articles were published in the prestigious medical journals, such as New England Journal of Medicine, saying that the potential for with this synthetic narcotics was relatively low, and the data of that was relatively small. But again, the journals articles carried a lot of weight, and the undertreatment, which was probably there, but the studies were really poorly conducted, or less reliable than they ought to have been. They were not large scale enough, so they were the people who were doing it were not able to draw reliable conclusions, and that there was a pharmaceutical company called Portnoy, okay, a part of Metropolitan Jewish Health System in New York City, that was partly encouraged by pharmaceutical industries, gained renown for advocating the consideration of opioid painkillers for chronic pain of all kinds. Okay, and including backache and pain due to arthritis and cancer and so on and so forth. And then although some of the people raised red flags that there is a potential, this was downplayed by the not so subtle payment and advertisement campaign by this pharma uh, boys. And this company maintained financial relationship with opioid drug manufacturer, i.e. Purdue Pharma, and some other varieties of pharmaceutical companies. And there were, so this inconclusive trials, had a bigger impact than they deserved. And so the drug use continued from 1995 for pain relief until 2010. And then they created something called American Pain Society, which was almost kind of a name for a big pharma arm. So, and this was the big drug that we will talk about, the oxycodone, which is a derivative of codone, which was synthesized as far back as 1916, marketed in 1939. Okay, and at the same time, that was for labor and delivery. Something called twilight sleep was being used. Merck Pharmaceutical introduced a product which included scopolamine, which has like an amnesic effect, so-called dream sleep, oxycodone, and ephedrine, which is a mild stimulant. So that induce a twilight sleep for the pain of labor and delivery. And Oxycontin was a brand name version of extended release oxycodone. So there are different versions. And so these belong to a class of opioids, as we called about, and that still has a substantial addiction potential. But the manufacturer, Purdue Pharmaceutical, which was relatively a small pharmaceutical that was initially marketing laxatives and really low profit margin drugs. So they bought out some British company and to market this in a capsule form, and the rest is history. And they promoted heavily with a very large sales network to economically deprived area, primarily in the mining towns in West Virginia and other, so-called Rust Belt cities. For example, a town in Virginia received 400 received 9 million pills in 2 years. Okay, and they had some varieties of marketing ploys. So they created a jingle, "Get in the swing with OxyContin." Okay, and so this is, it was a huge tragedy that went on under the nose of the federal and state governments, and there were other smaller agents called Percocet and Percodan were marketed as well, mixing it with aspirin and Tylenol, which were a lesser dose, but still had potential for abuse. Okay, and you can see I'll show many varieties of data on the drugs you can see the graphs that were from psychostimulant and the prescription opioid is the blue line. This gradually increased. Synthetic opioids increased dramatically after the prescription drug usage decreased. As you can see, it has really skyrocketed from 2013 to 2019. And the graph still continues, although there is some hope in the last year or so, which I'll get to in the last page. And the antidepressants have remained flat, so to speak. The Valium, that was a popular drug, that has again not increased that much. And cocaine is always the popular street drugs. There's no, so and this is called a disease of despair and death of despair, related to a worsening economy, and people do not have access to competent care and therapy. And again, the war on pain from cancer MDs played a big, not so small a role. And so role of big pharma plays, but some of the other drugs had potential for liver toxicity as well. So again, so it hit the people on varieties of fronts. Okay, and again, so you can just see the drug overdose has overtaken the common cause of death in America, car vehicles. You can see how this is a little older, but still very much the drug overdose have overtaken deaths from motor vehicle accidents and even America's favorite weapons, gun homicide, and the HIV, which was the epidemic earlier in the late 80s and 90s, have tapered off with good therapy and research. Okay, and the opium so we can see the age groups have different, type of thing that the older people are more using the prescription overdrugs, which are addicted to it, while the heroin is primarily is a drug of choice for the younger people. And again, this is not divided upon race, but I'm sure that plays a role. That the Okay, and again, these are the estimates of death. You can just see that the numbers keep increasing at least until, so this is fentanyl now is linked in 3 out of 5 overdose deaths nationwide. And this is the other drugs have increased, but they're still lagging far behind. And so this is almost, you can say, who is to be blamed? Obviously, the Purdue pharmaceutical was to be blamed earlier for OxyContin-related deaths. But then finally, the FDA, which was lagging behind in regulating this drug, the lawyers, the doctors, American Medical Association, lobbyists to the DEA, all were equally involved. And you can just see that the graph from 1992 to 2013, as you can see, and as inequality in healthcare availability has decreased, and the rural areas have increased dramatically. In the red, yes, you can see there was in this almost 20-year span. Okay, it has increased dramatically in all across the United States, but much more in the southeast and economically deprived area. And this may have to do with the economy, which changed from manufacturing basis earlier to service-related industry. So this was the pain of life needed to be, and because the integrated pain management is hard to access for people. And again, the prescription drug monitoring program has been instituted, and that has had some impact, and varieties of support to legitimate medical use. And that program called MedSafe has been initiated, which increases legitimate use, prevent drug abuse, diversion of people are pharmacy shopping. So this has had some impact in reducing the deaths. Okay, and so again, you can just see there's more and more data that shows the areas in the which have suffered from manufacturing jobs. You can see the deaths are substantially higher. In the dark red are the ones. Okay, and so people have moved from disability, and that has chronic pain type of thing has been a big factor. The extent in Appalachia, that is again, it's a huge number of deaths that took place, in the varieties of other counties which are economically deprived, and then the sales network that Purdue Pharmaceutical had was very extensive, and the average sales representative salary was, even in 2001, was 55,000, with bonuses ranging to more than their actual salary, and some of them earned as much as $250,000. So Purdue Pharmaceutical awarded heavily to the sales network, in bonuses and incentivizing pushing the drugs. So in just 4 years between 96 to 2000, the sales force increased double basically, and increased the calling on varieties of physicians, number. And so they not only just like lottery things, they had a patient starter coupon program with a free limited type prescriptions up from 7 to 30-day supply. And there were so many coupons were distributed, and little did they realize that it was hard for people to get off the drugs once they were on. And the doctors, who were so-called pill mill doctors, along with other lawyers, you know, who are responsible for it directly or indirectly. And varieties of politicians received campaign contributions from Purdue Pharmaceuticals. And there are some persistent DEA agents, but they were relatively in minority, and their voice was in the voice in the wilderness. Okay, and you can just see here again, this is another graph that prescribes, untreated pain, and some people who are prescribed alternate treatment, and at the same time, they are misusing, then the population basically dies. So this is uh, reducing the supply is one way of doing it, reducing diversion, increasing safety, and the so-called reduce harm program, so and once people are uh, run out of the prescription drugs, then they quickly end up reaching for street drugs such as heroin or fentanyl, and then it increasing, type of they're 8 times more likely to die. Okay, and at the same time, once they tightened up the prescription drugs, and doctors were afraid that they would be punished, so they managed to cut off people from getting their prescriptions, and and that led people to reach to your street drug pushers. So there are varieties of guidelines that the CDC has published, over the years as to how to strengthen and actually restrict the flow type thing. So there are programs that are available, and at the same time, the varieties, some of the other West Coast cities have tried, to safe injection sites, which has met with variable success. Some cities have started the program with good results initially, only to have it backfire, so they rescinded the program. And this was initially the so-called Vancouver problems, but from what I recall recently, that they have backtracked on some of their programs. Now, let's talk about the big family of the physicians who were owners of the Purdue Pharmaceutical that was responsible. So that can be considered American sickness, the so-called Sackler family saga. Okay, OxyContin was the product, and it was marketed in the 90s, and the Madison Avenue type of advertisement, okay, was and in the 90s, epidemic was so severe that every 15 minutes a child was born with drug withdrawal, and the number of prescriptions started rising dramatically. Okay, and the joblessness in teens, stress, and and the needle became the reach to. Now, who were the Sacklers? Arthur Sackler was oldest son of a Jewish immigrant. He went to medical school, became a psychiatrist. Okay, and he was savvy, and that he had initially, right from the high school, he had a talent for marketing. Started writing advertisement in high school magazines, became a copywriter for Sharing Pharmaceuticals, and later on became a physician. And he did some research work in electroconvulsive therapy and other psychiatric treatments. Okay, and then two of his brothers later on also went on and became a physician in spite of the stigma of Jewish quota. Okay, and he started, doing research and marketed something called biological psychiatry, because psychiatry in those days was primarily talk therapy based on the Freudian model, but he tried to put a biological spin on, started something called the radio network for MDs. Okay, and and at the same time, he was given evidence for the Senate committees of prescribing various medications, and at the same time, there was some competition with other advertising agency that was taking place, but Sackler came out ahead. Okay, and at the same times, and so they became, immensely rich, and at the same time became a philanthropist with various museums in New York City and Washington, D.C. area. So that's a huge saga as to almost like a, either one can say they were as wealthy as the Gatsbys, okay, or the Corleone family of the Godfather of fame. Okay, and this was three Brooklyn-born brothers that became a small pharmaceutical in the 50s called Purdue Frederick, and it was originally just made, really over-the-counter type of products. Okay, and then again, once they got the successful product, they started collecting art around the world and lived in a very luxurious lifestyle. So these are the three brothers. So one of them, Mortimer, established his fortune in UK. Okay, and the other two brothers stayed in the United States. Okay, and so in the American medicine in the 50s was really primitive as far as the psychiatric treatment because it primarily comprised of electroconvulsive therapy or shock therapy and lobotomy. Okay, and then later on, antibiotics were marketed. These were marketed by Dr. Sackler's advertising. He promoted something called terramycin, which is a broad spectrum antibiotic with the first major tranquilizer that came around called Thorazine, which emptied all the psychiatric hospital. He marketed that and advertised it very vigorously to various physicians. And later on, the drug which became the go-to drug for the advertising agency and the executive culture of United States called Milltown, and later on followed by the so-called minor tranquilizer called Librium. So Dr. Sackler's ad agency was successful in making these first billion-dollar drugs. Okay, and later on, went to Valium, which was, like a slightly modified version of Librium. Okay, and again for Roche Pharmaceuticals became a big seller. Okay, and this was the so-called Medical Tribune letter, which was sent out free to all the physicians and marketed the so-called Mother's Little Helper. So the MDs were, and they were very savvy marketers, and these were able to plant stories in various magazines that were popular. Okay, and then so again, his stand was there are no bad drugs, only bad people. Okay, and there's a varieties of publications that were putting new drugs basically. And at the same time, as an editor, he got quite a deal, 7.5% of advertising income plus other extra editing. So, and he gave evidence during the very public-spirited senator called Senator Kefauver. Okay, and the Senate, he was able to charm the Senate committees. That though he was considered as a hero for the medical and considered a brilliant doctor. So again, he was a admin to the max. Okay, and so this was his ad for terramycin. You can see ocular infections respond to broad spectrum terramycin. So that was his big agent. So McAdams was the promoted medical profession. So this was acquired, and so he acquired this other agency that was there because they become very rich promoting this varieties of new drugs, which were again, a groundbreaking product at that time. Okay, and you could see how this personalized letters that were sent to varieties of physicians. Okay, and the ads were masked as education. So this were and varieties of fake studies that were carried out in the 60s. Okay, and it were able to reach 600,000 physicians. Okay, and in varieties of countries, not just United States, but Europe, Southeast Asia. Okay, so this was, and by 1970s, Librium and Valium were earning almost $2 billion for client Roche Pharmaceutical out of Switzerland. Okay, and so this was, as we saw, this was earlier. It was marketing tonics and marketing laxatives. Okay, and then they bought out a small British company which made coating of the pill so that can be slow release type of thing, and MS codeine that was marketed. And later on, this was uh, uh, his son followed his father's footsteps. Okay, and and again, the varieties of academic symposia were sponsored by them, and they attacked the quote unquote untreated pain. Okay, and this was some of his donations. He was a big fan of Egyptian culture. He bought out and the Chinese, antiques, and he bought enough antiques on his own so that he was running out of storage spaces. So he talked the Metropolitan Museum in New York City to open his own gallery and got his name on it and was able to find a nice storage space for his, vast collection, the Temple of Dendur. Okay, so this was, he gave the donation to be spanned out over a number of years, and so he became, and he became a celebrity of New York City with the mayor Ed Koch. Okay, and then this private collection was stored at the museum. So and then he when the Metropolitan turned down some of his offers, he went to Washington D.C. and formed at the Smithsonian Institute or something called what is still very much there, may have been renamed now, called the Sackler Gallery. And he also donated extensively to various prestigious universities, including Harvard and MIT. Okay, so he was a force to be reckoned with. Okay, and MS Contin went because of the name morphine became stigma. So that's then they changed the name to OxyContin. Okay, and it was originally and MS Contin was marketed only for cancer pain, while OxyContin was promoted for all sorts of pain. Okay, and so this was, and they promoted people with chronic pain, and some some patients have so-called addiction type higher potential, either the genetically markup is such. So, and their claim was this is a non-addicting substance but safer. Okay, so once it was approved very quickly because of a person who was, you know, originally worked for FDA and then later on went to work for Purdue Pharmaceuticals. Okay, and so they were able to, create sort of fake pain management seminars, and so this was Swing It Alive. That's are the slogans for Purdue. Okay, a perfect choice for mascot because much like gorilla, OxyContin might seem appealing, but if not careful, it will tear you apart. Okay, so and they were promoting this was so-called pseudo addiction, and their defense lawyer team, which included none other than Rudy Giuliani. Okay, and so the FDA was misled, to put it mildly, and they marketed it, as a less addicting drug. Okay, and they promoted it, with OxyContin, I got my life back. Type of fake videos were marketed. And this is an example of some of these coupons that were handed out with bonus to salespeople, as I talked about earlier. And titrating the dose up was promoted from 20 to as high as 160 milligrams. So this was, and it was a very easy potential for abuse for chewing, crushing, biting, snorting, and cooking. So, the capsule they claimed it was not breakable, but people found ways to get around it. Okay, and so this were, early reports as early as 1997 occurred. Okay, but and varieties of pill mills and increasingly dosage were promoted by unscrupulous pharmaceuticals of salespeople. And this is the great Rudy Giuliani. Okay, and and there were some other people who are on the list. Okay, and some of the attorneys took fall for the Sacklers, basically, and they were found guilty for defrauding and paid the pharmaceutical. So, and then again, so the real owners got off scot-free. So, okay, and then some lone district physicians and small-time DAs in Virginia were raising flags, but they were, outwitted or outspent by, and you can see that the varieties of protests that were carried out for people whose loved ones had died. And OxyContin kills, you can just see relatives against pharmaceuticals. the Long physicians, okay, they established West Virginia lawyers. They filed a suit, but then eventually Justice Department, for whatever reasons, decided to drop the legal suit. Okay, and the sales continued, to supply rogue pharmaceuticals, and they just and so they made an attempts to make the tablet tamper-proof, and it was released later on as OxyContin OP. Okay, and then when it became difficult to obtain, people who were the OxyContin addicts turned to heroin. So they traded one drug for another. Okay, and the state of Kentucky, sued Purdue Pharmaceutical. Okay, and they're and looking to see they've managed to settle out of court. They were hiding the document, and then they started gradually marketing to other markets. So they extended their reach to other nations. Okay, and they again, donated to varieties of prestigious universities: Oxford, Glasgow, the museums in the Louvre, the Jewish Museum in Berlin, Imperial College. So their philanthropy was far and wide. Okay, and at the same time, their companies were headquartered in Bermuda as tax havens, and they started pushing the drugs in other countries, less developed countries such as India, Mexico, and China. Okay, and they knew that the effect did not last more than 12 hours based on their own clinical trial, but they started continued marketing it as a 12-hour drug. Okay, and they encouraged physicians to prescribe larger and larger doses. Okay, and people, where most people end up taking later than 60 milligrams. Okay, and finally, some states got wise to it, and in 2019, Massachusetts named Sacklers as defendant. But by that time, they had transferred their wealth elsewhere to heavens. And the people whose loved ones and patients who suffered, they took up the protest. This was shame on Sacklers. This was a groundbreaking, people fired, crowd-source-driven movement that started. You can just see Sacklers live and thousands die. Okay, and there was a well-known photographer who was addicted herself named Nan Godin. I'll have a picture for her later on. So they protested against all these museums who were taking the donations from Sacklers and giving them a of respectability. As you can see this way, and varieties of documentaries have been published. These are some of them are well worth reading. Okay, in the part 2, okay, I paid Oklahoma $270 million. Okay, and by this time, some of the judges were favorable to the Purdue Pharmaceuticals, and they avoided varieties of suits in other states. So they were taking on each state at a time, and they were outlawing them. Okay, demand to be sent, anything you can do to reduce direct contact with Richard is appreciated. So how they managed to stay above the fray and tried to avoid being named into the disaster that took place. Okay, and so some of the statements that are there demanded to be sent into the field with the sales representative. Anything you can do to reduce direct contact with Richard, who is one of the Sackler heirs, is to be appreciated. This is not too bad. So they paid out settlements, and this was the famous protest that was done at the Metropolitan in the atrium of the museum. Okay, they pretended, showed and this is Nan Goldin. Okay, so a blizzard of prescription, and that we were the people being buried. And this is Nan Goldin, who was a photographer and founded an organization called PAIN, Prescription Addiction Intervention Now, against opioid epidemic. She was a former drug user herself, and so this was the protest at the headquarters in Connecticut. Okay, and finally the museums found religion, and the famous Louvre removed their name, Smithsonian delinked them, Tufts was reluctant, and finally the varieties of, they tried to find settlement with the Justice Department decided not to pursue congressional hearing for whatever reasons, and they offered $1 billion settlement. Okay, and to avoid a jail sentence. And this is their, Purdue headquarters in Connecticut. Okay, and these are the people who have died, and they have still haven't received any compensation. Okay, and varieties of technologies have been offered for such as for addiction behavior, including transcranial magnetic stimulation, direct current stimulation, a more surgically challenging technique called deep brain stimulation, and last but not the least, the more recent GLP-1 drugs such as Ozempic have been shown to be some early benefit for drug addiction. Okay, and this is a video. Hopefully I can play it without.
The number one cause of accidental death, again, is drug overdose, and that'll likely be true this year as well. But interestingly enough, not only is it ahead of car accidents and handgun violence, but also it's greater now than HIV or AIDS was, killing people in the mid-90s. There is very little that we have been doing to stop it when we could have. This is where the insanity comes into play. Another way of describing insanity is stigma and discrimination. I think we've heard that from some of our other speakers. It's just crazy, and there's a price to pay for it. I think that's the lesson here. What I want to do is let you know where this has crept into things and where we often have sat silent while this has happened, to the great detriment of many of us. The other feature of this I need you to understand is about potency. And that is, in a particular quantity of something, it's either stronger or less strong. For instance, opium is the beginning point of a lot of natural opioids. And when it was making its way to heroin, an illicit drug market in Chicago where there is no quality control, the range was from somewhere around 0 to 10 in potency and power. Now that range is from 0 to 10,000. And again, no quality control, no ability to tell the difference between those things. So you can see the risk of overdose is much, much greater. We talk about saying no to drugs. Nancy Reagan's cure-all answer to this. And there's some people that say no to drugs, or the war on drugs, ending the war on drugs, I'm sorry. But the purpose of it is it meets many people's needs. One way of looking at it economically is the US is simply driving up price supports and supporting these industries, and has been for a long time. The question we all have to ask is, has this helped? Has this approach been effective? Or has it led us to where we are today? My daughter is 14, and this is her book this year on drug education. Now, as you look at this as an 8th grader, would you say, this is inspiring education, knowledge, understanding, hope, ending stigma, discrimination, or maybe just about the opposite of those? Add a fear and worry to the mix. That dog could be very nice. And at least there's one locker open to hide in. But this is basically what we've done. We have, since the Richard Nixon era, we began incarcerating huge numbers of our population. I wonder how many of you know that the United States is the #1 incarcerator by rate of any country in the world. More so than Russia, more so than other totalitarian regimes. And it's also, drug laws from the very beginning have had a racist theme to them. People in Illinois, in a Human Rights Watch report in 2000, Illinois incarcerates African American and Latino men and women by 57 times greater rate than Caucasians, despite equal levels of drug use. So and then if you look at what caused a lot of these drug laws to be created, you'll see the racist intentions, outright racist claims. So it's with regards to saying, no, it truly is a possibility if we can manage pain differently. Well, what does it take to manage pain differently? It takes more time. Generally, it takes more thoughtfulness, takes more effort on the part of the patient and the practitioner, the medical person. So, and the other thing is, will insurance companies pay for this? Generally, the answer has been no. Well, if you give, this is makes a lot of sense. If someone has a toothache, you give them enough pills for the toothache, pain to subside. Maybe that's 3 to 5 days worth instead of 90 days worth. And finally, you acknowledge that our species is an intoxicating one, and you try to increase the opportunity for healthier intoxication versus more dangerous intoxication. In this case, cannabis. No one has ever died from cannabis intoxication, except that one case where a ton of cannabis fell on some guy at the shipping dock. So we treat doctors and other medical providers in a very disrespectful way. We give them a responsibility, and they've been blamed, they've been stigmatized, they've been discriminated against because of their conduit to opioids. There have been physicians that are serving time in prison now for decades because of this. And we don't even allow them to practice the most scientifically based effective treatments for opioid abuse and addiction. So to blame them for it, to me, seems highly hypocritical. One way that we might see this in history is the Supreme Court. They decided that it wasn't a legitimate practice of medicine for a medical provider to make his or her patient feel more comfortable. This was 100 years ago. This has been cited as a precedent as recently as 1986, so it's not exactly the too distant past. But we act as if this is the current situation. Again, physicians cannot practice that. They can practice something we call prescription drug monitoring programs. And what that is basically you, your healthcare provider, and a police officer in the room. You may not see the police officer. They may just wait till the information is entered in the data about controlled substances, and then they can look at it. They can make decisions about what you do and don't do, what the prescriber does and doesn't do because of that. And how many people knew this program existed? Now in all 50 states. This is the number one recommendation of the American Medical Association to deal with the overdose pandemic. Well, let's see how it works. I like to call it pressing docs to be malevolent towards their patients. If I go to see a healthcare worker and I'm in pain, I want that doctor to help me with the pain. If they don't, to fight, take one for the team, they can go to hell. So let me explain a little bit what this has done. Again, we've put a lot of effort into it, a lot of effort of all kinds. And so here we have, again, all 50 states. Around 10 years ago, this rate of prescription opioids causing death started to drop. Well, that's a good thing. We know that prescription drug monitoring programs lessen the amount of milligrams of opioid in the community. So that's a good thing, right? Well, it's good if you only look at this, but if you look down here, at around the same time, heroin, and a little later, fentanyl, the highly potent synthetics, start shooting way up. These are people we call pharma refugees, people that have been alienated from the medical system and going into illicit markets where there's no control of potency. And I'll give you an idea just how different in potency this is. Here is potentially an overdose amount of heroin. This is an overdosing amount of fentanyl, and this is an overdosing amount of the most powerful.
I've already went over that, so I think I'm going to stop this here. But this is a gentleman called Dan Briggs. He's part of the Chicago Recovery Alliance. And so that's the program that he talks about. We've gone over most of the points, type. And now some of the other countries have taken a different approach. For example, in Italy, there was a free needle exchange and safe consumption site was provided. Same thing was done in Vancouver. And Switzerland even went further, that their government started something called the heroin treatment program. And they've had varieties of success with this rate. Okay, so this was a TED talk from the University of Chicago by this gentleman. And then again, there is a clinical criminal investigation in opioid manufacture that was finally started in 2020. And there was the largest penalty that was imposed, criminal fine of $3.5 billion with a criminal forfeiture of $2 billion. Okay, and so they were started, the Purdue Pharmaceutical declared bankruptcy. Okay, and then one doctor, so there were varieties of, they knew very much that they had so-called bad actors provided, but the sales representatives continued to meet this doctor. They met this guy who was actually had a nickname of the Candyman, and crazy dosing of OxyContin. Still, the firm sales representative continued meeting him for more than 300 times. So they exactly knew what they were doing. And at the same time, the secular pharmaceutical family avoided going to prison, at least so far. And these are some of the treatment options that are available: the harm reduction program, newer drugs, and long-term rehabilitation, cognitive behavioral therapy. Okay, so these are, varieties, and easy availability of naloxone injectable and nasal spray, needle exchange program, and testing for potency of the street drugs has been introduced. Less addictive opioid called Suboxone has been marketed as well. So, and these are, and they continue to deny responsibility. The Purdue Pharmaceutical said one day after David Sackler threatened that the family would drop out of the settlement. Okay, and this was, so they were, uh, trying to avoid prison centers by paying off huge sums of money. Okay, and they finally, one of the chairmen did admit that the company knowingly supplied OxyContin to doctors who were suspended for illegally prescribing the drug, while telling the DEA that they were working to do the opposite. Okay, what has happened in 2014? Supreme Court, the conservative Supreme Court rejected the multi-billion-dollar Purdue Pharmaceutical settlement that was reached by about 20 or 30 states. Okay, Justice Kavanaugh wrote a dissent. That decision will have a devastating effect on thousands of victims. Okay, and they were, trying to avoid, prison centers. Basically, that's what, and they were guarding their own assets. Arthur died before OxyContin was invented. The other people died but their family is still, their legacy is continued. Okay, and the next scion of the family, Richard Sackler, it continued to keep himself distance from the family's involvement. Okay, and the museums also began to reject donations from them, and the drug overdoses are dropping. And these are some of the reasons. Naloxone is much easier to find. Treatment is still hard to obtain, but some reforms could be saving the lives. And there is a street drug called xylazine, which is actually a veterinarian drug that is contaminated a fentanyl supply that has even much more side effects and is potentially lethal. Okay, and that now you think that the Purdue Pharmaceutical has disappeared. They have just morphed into a subsidiary company with multiple tentacles all over the world called Mundi Pharma, and they are still continuing to sell the rest of the world $330 billion of OxyContin outside the United States, as from 2016 onwards. And these are some of the profits that are there. And you can see their reach is wide range all over the world, basically. So this is close to $500 million that they have generated profit as recently as 2022. And this company is listed in so many other countries that this is that hard to prosecute. Okay, and what is xylene? This is one of the animal products that is used as a contaminant for it. So I think I've talked about the current status of the epidemic. There is some hope, but still this was a tragedy of epic proportion, and with the greed of pharmaceuticals, physicians, and the failure of the system that has caused thousands of lives. And hopefully we have learned something from it. Thank you, folks. It's been fun.